The law says that if you're engaged in the business of dealing firearms, your motivation is profit.
The Justice Department just announced a new rule taking effect today that clarifies who must obtain a federal firearms license.
Background check loopholes and unlicensed gun dealers have contributed to some of the most horrific and senseless tragedies.
The Justice Department announced a new rule to clarify who must obtain a federal firearms license.
The Biden administration announcing new changes to gun rules this morning, which will soon affect thousands of private sellers of firearms.
Good on its threat to crack down on gun dealers by preparing to enforce some new federal rules.
All right, folks, buckle up because we've got some hot off the press news from the ATF. They've just dropped a shocker in the form of a brand spanking new final rule all about gun sales. It's causing quite the stir in the firearms community. So what's all the fuss about? Well, imagine the ATF is playing a game of Jenga, but instead of pulling out wooden blocks, they're redefining terms left and right. This final rule isn't just a minor tweak. It's a major overhaul of how we understand the business of selling firearms. You're a gun enthusiast, maybe even a small-time seller at local gun shows. You've been doing your thing, buying and selling firearms as a hobby, or maybe to make a little extra cash on the side. But now, the ATF is saying, hold up, cowboy, we're changing the rules of the game. They're diving deep into the nitty-gritty of what it means to be engaged in the business of selling firearms. It used to be a bit vague, but not anymore. The ATF wants to make it crystal clear, if you're in it for the profit, you better have a federal license to back it up. No more flying under the radar as a casual seller. They're tightening the reins on who can legally sell guns.
The Justice Department just announced a new rule taking effect today that clarifies who must obtain a federal firearms license.
Background check loopholes and unlicensed gun dealers have contributed to some of the most horrific and senseless tragedies.
The Justice Department announced a new rule to clarify who must obtain a federal firearms license.
The Biden administration announcing new changes to gun rules this morning, which will soon affect thousands of private sellers of firearms.
And let's talk about the impact, shall we? It's like tossing a boulder into a pond. The ripples are felt far and wide. Gun owners and sellers alike are sounding the alarm, worried about what this means for their rights and livelihoods. Some are concerned they'll get caught in the crossfire of these new regulations, while others fear it's just the tip of the iceberg for stricter gun control measures. Bottom line, this isn't your grandma's rule book. The ATF's final rule on gun sales is shaking things up in a big way. Whether you're a gun-toting enthusiast or just a curious bystander, it's a development worth keeping an eye on. Stay tuned because the drama's just getting started.
The administration took historic action to reduce the number of firearms sold to people without background checks.
New rules will require background screenings before anybody can buy guns online or in person at gun shows.
Under this regulation, it will not matter if guns are sold on the internet, at a gun show.
Plans to close the so-called gun show loophole, which is sparking Republican backlash on Capitol Hill.
Modified definitions. Let's break down some of the juiciest bits of this new ATF rule. The revamped definitions of dealer and engaging in the business. It's like they've given the old rulebook a makeover and people are talking about it. First up, we've got the definition of dealer. It used to be pretty straightforward. If you were selling guns, you were a dealer. But now, the ATF has cast a wider net. They're not just targeting folks selling firearms. They're also roping in those who repair guns or even act as pawnbrokers. It's like they're saying if you're in the gun game in any capacity, we're watching you. And then there's the whole spiel about engaging in the business. This is where things get really interesting. The ATF is basically saying, hey, if you're out here selling guns and your main goal is to make a profit, you better have a federal license to back it up. It's a bit like saying, if you're in it for the money, you better play by our rules.
To be licensed dealers, that is, people who are engaging in the business of selling guns for profit.
The Biden administration has unveiled a new federal rule to expand background checks for gun purchases.
Anyone who sells firearms predominantly to earn a profit to become federally licensed and conduct background checks.
Attorney General Merrick Garland unveiled a new rule to require mostly anyone who sells guns to run a federal background check.
So what does this mean for Joe Schmo who sells a few rifles out of his garage on the weekends? Well, it means he might need to rethink his side hustle. The days of flying under the radar as a casual seller are over. Now, if you want to make a buck selling firearms, you better be prepared to jump through some bureaucratic hoops. But here's the kicker. It's not just about making a quick buck, it's about the broader implications of these definitions. People are worried about what this means for their rights as gun owners and sellers. They're concerned that these new rules are just the beginning of a slippery slope towards stricter gun control measures. So buckle up, because the ATF's new definitions are shaking up the gun world. Whether you're a seasoned gun enthusiast or just a casual observer, it's a development worth paying attention to. After all, when the rules change, everyone's got to play by them, whether they like it or not.
Definition of who must obtain a license and conduct a background check before selling firearms.
Rule now authorizes the ATF to require anyone selling guns to commercially, that is, to register and do background checks.
Regulation, it will not matter if guns are sold on the internet, at a gun show, or at a brick-and-mortar store.
Exclusions and presumptions. Let's dive into the impact of this ATF rule on personal collections. You know, those treasured stashes of firearms that folks keep for all sorts of reasons. Well, brace yourselves, because there's some eyebrow-raising stuff happening here. First off, let's talk about the exclusions. You'd think your personal collection of guns would be off limits, right? I mean, they're yours. You've acquired them over the years, maybe for sentimental reasons or just because you're a die-hard collector. But hold your horses, because the ATF has thrown a curveball. They're saying if you've got guns primarily for self-defense, they don't count as part of your collection. Say what? So those trusty firearms you've kept by your bedside for peace of mind? Nope, they don't get a pass. And then there are these presumptions. Talk about adding a layer of uncertainty to the mix.
Or whether you're doing it at a gun show or whether you're doing it on a new social media platform.
Regardless of whether they're selling on the internet, at a gun show, or brick and mortar stores.
Following the rules, which includes getting licenses and running background checks.
This regulation is a historic step in the Justice Department's fight against gun violence.
The ATF is basically saying, we're going to make some educated guesses about who's in the business of selling guns, and if you fit the bill, well, you better watch out. It's like they're playing detective, trying to sniff out who's just a hobbyist and who's running a full-blown gun-selling operation from their basement. So what does this mean for gun owners and sellers? It's like walking on eggshells. There's this cloud of uncertainty hanging over everyone's head. Will the ATF come knocking on your door, accusing you of being in the gun business, when all you wanted was to add a few pieces to your collection? It's enough to make anyone break out in a cold sweat. And let's not forget the broader implications here. People are worried that these exclusions and presumptions are just the beginning of a slippery slope towards stricter gun control measures. They're concerned about their rights as gun owners and the impact this rule could have on their way of life.
You can't just go after the supply of guns and pretend that the shooters don't need to be dealt with to enforce them to protect the community. Look, everything we do at ATF begins and ends with public safety. That's our role. We're the only federal agency with the sole mission of protecting people from violent crime.
Legal challenges and concerns. All right, let's talk Turkey about the potential legal showdown brewing over this ATF rule. Things are about to get legally spicy. First off, it's no secret that there are some serious concerns about the broad scope of this rule. We're talking about redefining who's considered a gun dealer and what it means to be engaged in the business of selling firearms. That's not exactly small potatoes. It's no surprise that legal eagles are gearing up for a fight. They're sharpening their pencils, poring over the fine print, and getting ready to throw down in court. But it's not just the scope of the rule that's got people riled up. It's also the constitutionality of certain provisions. Folks are raising eyebrows and asking tough questions about whether these new rules are crossing the line when it comes to Second Amendment rights. After all, the right to bear arms is pretty sacrosanct in this country, and any attempt to chip away at it is bound to raise a few red flags.
Augusta at the State House today in a public hearing over a last-minute push from Maine Democrats for a controversial red flag law.
So has the debate about whether new laws would be fair to law-abiding gun owners.
The bill would effectively bypass the need for a mental health evaluation to remove someone's guns if a judge grants an emergency order.
State lawmakers are considering a red flag law, but there's considerable pushback to that idea.
And let's not forget about practical enforceability. I mean, sure, the ATF can write all the rules they want, but actually enforcing them is a whole other ballgame. There are concerns about how these new regulations will be implemented on the ground. Will law enforcement agencies be able to effectively enforce them? Will they lead to unintended consequences or even potential misuses of power? These are all questions that need to be addressed.
Good on its threat to crack down on gun dealers by preparing to enforce some new federal rules.
The law says that if you're engaged in the business of dealing firearms, your motivation is profit.
The Justice Department is issuing one of the most significant gun regulations in decades.
Licensed firearms dealers then are required to do a whole bunch of things to protect the public.
Broad impact and conclusion. All right, let's wrap up this roller coaster ride through the ATF's new rule with a look at its broad impact and a dose of conclusion. First things first, let's talk about the impact. This rule isn't just shaking things up for one particular group, it's sending shockwaves through the entire gun-owning and selling community. Whether you're a casual collector, a weekend gun show seller, or a pawnbroker with a side hustle, this rule has got you in its sights. It's like the ripple effect of a stone thrown into a pond. Everyone's feeling the effects, whether they realize it or not. And that brings us to the conclusion. Now more than ever, there's a pressing need for further examination of this rule's implications. We can't just sit back and let the ATF call the shots without a second thought. We need to dig deep, ask tough questions, and push back when necessary. After all, our Second Amendment rights are on the line, and we can't afford to take them for granted. But it's not just about asking questions. It's also about taking action.
White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention, I'm very excited to tell you that as of today, we are closing the gun show loophole.
The Biden administration is announcing a new rule aimed at closing what's known as the gun show loophole.
Would require anyone who sells firearms for profit to be federally registered and conduct background checks.
Whether it's through legal challenges, grassroots advocacy, or just spreading the word, we all have a role to play in standing up for our rights. So let's roll up our sleeves, rally the troops, and make our voices heard. Because when it comes to defending our rights, there's no time to waste. That's all for this video, folks. See you next time.